All right, so I want to talk to you briefly about The Last of the Mohicans. Now, this selection that we're reading, of course, is very, very short. It's just a few pages long. Uh, the novel itself is rather long, and of course, it's one of a series of novels. You may have seen the Daniel Day-Lewis film, Last of the Mohicans. I think it came out, well, it's probably been pushing 30 years now, but it's a really good classic film. But if you're not familiar at all with The Last of the Mohicans, this is a fairly representative sample. As the introductory material mentions, Fenimore Cooper was tremendously popular uh, in his time as a representative American uh, author, and people were tremendously interested in what America was like before, right? I mean, we're 200 years or so into uh, the American experiment as far as colonization and then becoming, uh, states within a nation. And so there is this period of past now, and people are tremendously interested, Americans, but especially Europeans, in what this landscape was like, especially when it was first discovered, what the native people were like. And it gets meshed into this romantic movement. And so what what you have, of course, is a sort of cleaned up version of the interactions between uh, settlers and the Native Americans, which has caused Cooper to fall out of favor with a lot of people. I think that's understandable, but at the same time, uh, I think it's really important to be able to see um, the way that the representation was done by Cooper, and to think about why he was represented the way he was. The introductory material, I think, does a nice job of letting you know that, one of the things that Fenimore Cooper is doing is that um, he's questioning. He's critical of these interactions and the way that they happened. And he is largely responsible for developing what becomes known as the noble savage. Again, um, this is not viewed as a positive thing now, but the idea was to represent Native Americans uh, differently than they had been initially. I mean, when we looked at those earlier writings, if you think about Mary Rowlandson, it was this constant sort of, they're savages, they're um, they're almost demonic, right? They're almost spiritual uh, forces on par with witches or demons or something like this that dwell in this pagan landscape. And one of the things that Fenimore Cooper is trying to do is kind of recover the image of the Native American, um, to talk about their positive aspects, um, to think about what their culture actually was rather than to deprive them of a culture, to think about what their religion was rather than to deprive them of a religion, and to sort of think about the beauty and the majesty of the Native American, right? And so you end up with this picture of the noble savage, um, which is this idea that the Native Americans, contrary to those initial responses that saw them as being ignorant and savage and so forth, that they're actually committed to a higher ethical or moral standard even than the Christians are. That they're pure somehow. They haven't been corrupted by modernization, industrialization, and those sort of modern influences that have um, corrupted the white man, right? So And this is seen in all kinds of things, the fact that they don't have the same kind of shame that the white man has, so they don't wear as much clothing, right? That their speech seems more simple and direct, which is interpreted as them being um, insightful or wise and honest. Um, they use simpler tools, more primitive tools, bows and arrows rather than rifles. Um, you know, Tomahawks and uh, horn knives rather than scimitars and swords and big axes and other sorts of uh, more European style tools, right? I mean, their fishing is simpler, their hunting is simpler, the houses they construct are simpler. Um, the laws that they have that govern their society are fewer and easier to interpret, more literal. And so uh, that's all really positive stuff. It becomes negative, of course, because it becomes this sort of all encompassing stereotypical here is the Native American, that this is what they are. And so this has caused problems for Fenimore Cooper's for his reputation through the years. But I think it's important to look at that in the context of what we're doing in terms of the growth of the literature. It cannot be overstated how popular these books were and the incredible number of authors that they influenced. What I want to look at here in this very, very small section, I want to look a little bit at the way in which this is a nice representation of the American Gothic setting. And I want to begin to talk about characterization using this piece. Now, there's not a lot of characters here, and there's not a lot of plot, so you don't get to see a lot of development of characters. So we're not going to talk about major and minor or dynamic and static type characters here. But I do want to talk about characterization, and I think this is a nice way to look at direct versus implied characterization, because you do get nice portraits of the characters here, but you also have a very nice Gothic American setting, right? So one of the things that you see immediately where this picks up is it's set in an old part of the forest. There are lots of large trees. We're told that there's a thick canopy to the forest that overhangs this river running through the valley. There's nice descriptions here by Fenimore Cooper of the rays of the sun filtering down through the trees, sort of modeling the ground with light, the darkness of the water as it flows under the canopy. So there are hints here at that inconsistent light, shifting light, lots of areas of deep shadow, and that's all very Gothic, right? And within that old forest space, we have this neat interiority where there is this sort of small clearing, just very, very small, where there are a couple of trees down, and the men are sitting on these logs. And so it is very much, a sort of fireside area. You can imagine being in an old English castle or large manor with just the big expansive building. And here these two men are sort of sitting in this small parlor near a fire, right? And that's essentially what's happening. And so you can see how Fenimore Cooper uses the landscape in the way that an English writer would use the architecture, right? So the scene then is set up nicely. On page 531, we're told that there are feeble and broken sounds. So again, it's not just the light that doesn't penetrate clearly through all of the trees. It's the brokenness of sound. Things sound far off. You get bits and pieces of them. They're familiar to these forest, uh, he calls them foresters, right? But all that means is people who are used to being in the forest there. It's not a profession like logging or something. Um, but again, you can imagine how this would work in an English Gothic novel. You would have sounds from rooms far off in the house, footsteps or the sound of a servant shuffling, working with dishes or something. Bits and pieces of sound, smatterings of sound that come in from a distance. Same thing happening here in the woods. So it is a very Gothic sort of setting. And later on, what we get to see is actually the son of Chingachgook, right? So you've who is Uncas, right? So the son of Chingachgook is Uncas. Uncas shows up almost out of nowhere. That is how the Gothic setting works, right? That if you were in an old manor or an old cathedral or an old castle, there would be some kind of a secret passage, or there would be not even a secret passage necessarily, but just a door that or a passageway that's obscured by shadow or a column, or around a corner, out of which someone could appear suddenly. And that's essentially the way the forest works, where they're sitting, Hawkeye and Chingachgook, having this discussion. And then out of nowhere on 531, Uncas shows up. He said, "Uncas is here," said another voice in the same soft guttural tones near his elbow. "Who wishes Uncas?" And it's so startling, we're told the white man loosed his knife in his leather sheath and made an involuntary movement of the hand towards his rifle at this sudden interruption. It's just the suddenness of it, right? This is a person Hawkeye, who is, we've already been told, used to all the sounds of the forest. He hears things and processes the sounds without having to really be conscious of them. He's not the kind of person who can be snuck up on. He's not the kind of person who can be surprised. And yet, this environment lends itself to that sort of thing. And so we have Uncas comes essentially out of nowhere. He's like a spirit that just materializes. And then later we see something similar when Uncas is able to creep within a few yards of the deer, right? That Hawkeye is going to shoot it from far away. Instead, Uncas says, I'll shoot it with the arrow, but you have to be close to be able to do that. And so it says on 535 that he threw himself on the ground and approached the animal with wary movements. When within a few yards of the cover, he fitted an arrow to his bow with the utmost care while the antlers moved, etc., etc. In another moment, the twang of the bow was heard. A white streak was seen glancing into the bushes. So Uncas has shot the deer. He darts out and cuts its throat very, very quickly. And part of this, as Hawkeye points out, right, is the skill. He says 'twas done with Indian skill. So part of this is about developing that noble Indian, the noble savage, showing how much greater skill these people have in this landscape than what the white man has. But part of it is the establishment of this sort of Gothic setting in which the forest provides an environment in which people can move from one place to another unseen, unheard, right? Because that's important in the Gothic. And so it's almost as though Uncas, he materializes out of nowhere as he comes through the forest into the clearing, but then the same thing as he sort of disappears back into the woods and then materializes a few yards away from the deer. And so it functions in a very Gothic sense that way, even this very small piece of setting. And I wanted to illustrate that, right? The suppression of sound in a forest, the suppression of light in a forest, all work very much as they would in an interior space in an old Gothic church or manor or castle. And remember, when you've got that Gothic setting, those buildings are enormous, so you have to have that huge space, and then there's an interiority within that huge space, and the forest functions that way. So you have always this contrast between the largeness of the whole thing and then that small interior space where things are focused. As far as characterization goes, you have a good amount of direct characterization here. Remember, direct characterization is when the characteristics of a character are delivered directly to you, usually by the narrator, but it can be by other characters. And so we get good narration here on page 531. We're told that in terms of the Indian Chingachgook, we have he was seated on the end of a mossy log in a posture that permitted him to heighten the effect of his earnest language, the calm, expressive gestures of an Indian engaged in debate. His body, nearly naked, presented a terrific emblem of death, drawn in intermingled colors of white and black. His closely shaved head, on which no other hair than the well-known and chivalrous scalping tuft was preserved, was without ornament of any kind, with the exception of a solitary eagle's plume that crossed his crown and depended over the left shoulder. A tomahawk scalping knife of English manufacture were in his girdle, while a short military rifle of the same sort that the whites armed their savage allies lay carelessly across his bare and sinewy knees. The expanded chest, fully formed limbs, grave countenance of the warrior would denote he had reached the vigor of his days. Right? So that's all direct characterization. It is a beautiful description of the character. And intermixed with that physical description are comments about his quality as well. Right? He's proud. He is a person of authority. He is a warrior. He is alert. He is measured, right? And then we have the contrasting description of Hawkeye. We're told the frame of the white man, judging by such parts as were not concealed by his clothes. So immediate contrast, right? That the Indian is almost completely naked. Here is the white man clothed to the point that you can barely see any of his features. He looked like one who had known hardship and exertion from his earliest youth, as opposed to the Indian, right, who is older and an image of death, but powerful, right? In him, we're told, no symptoms of decay. The white man, his person, though muscular, was rather attenuated than full. Every nerve and muscle appeared strung and indurated by unremitted exposure and toil. So, again, direct characterization of Hawkeye here, right? The narrator is telling you about him. Look at those contrasts between the characters. See the commentary here being made about English culture, or now American culture, versus the Native American. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of labor. There's a lot of toil in the representation here of the white man, right, as he's called. And you don't get that in the representation of the Indian. in a lot of ways, the representation that Fenimore Cooper provides favors the Native American. And that's important, right? Because that is a significant shift away from the Puritan culture that we saw early on, in which wilderness was to be feared. It was full of these vicious native people who were almost demonic. And yet here we have this romantic notion of, oh no, this is the last of them, and what have we done? Look how beautiful and noble they are. Look how wise they are. Look how at one with nature they are. Their physical beauty, the beauty and simplicity of their language. There is a melancholy to it. Remember, that common thread that runs through all of the Romantic and especially the Gothic is melancholy. It is a sense of the loss, right? That this culture is lost. The last of the Mohicans. This is what Chingachgook says of Uncas, that when I'm gone, Uncas will be the last. There are no more. So there's a lot to unpack in something like this. It's, again, very, very short, but I wanted to illustrate how it functions in terms of representing a American Gothic setting, because that forest becomes super, super important now as we start to shift over and look at Hawthorne and the way he uses the forest. And I wanted to look at this as an illustration of direct and implied characterization. The implied characterization, by the way, right, comes from a character's own actions and words and thoughts. So we can see that in the discussions between Chingachgook and Hawkeye. When they're discussing where the Native American people came from and what the relationship was between them early, right? So when we look at 532, Hawkeye says, "My fathers fought with the naked red man." There is no difference, Hawkeye. Sorry. I confused myself. It's not Hawkeye speaking, right? It's Chingachgook speaking. He says, "My fathers fought with the naked red man," returned the Indian sternly in the same language. Is there no difference, Hawkeye, between the stone-headed arrow of the warrior and the leaden bullet with which you kill? And of course, the bullet and the arrow become metaphors for the two different cultures, right? Hawkeye responds, "There is reason in an Indian, though nature has made him with a red skin." So, and then he goes on to say, "I'm no scholar, and I care not who knows it. But judging from what I have seen at deer chases and squirrel hunts of the sparks below, I should think a rifle in the hands of their grandfathers, was not so dangerous as a hickory bow and a good flint head might be, if drawn with Indian judgment and sent by an Indian eye." Now, the narrator's not telling us here anything about Hawkeye, but Hawkeye is revealing something here about himself, and that is he doesn't see the advantage of the Europeans in using rifles. He doesn't see the technological superiority as a tremendous advantage, because he views it as a matter of skill. And in his mind, the Indians have equal skill with the bow as the Europeans have with the rifle, and so there is no advantage. So what we learn from him is what we would say now, right? He doesn't see his own privilege. He doesn't see the advantage of his position. So there has to be some other reason why the settlers have been able to defeat these noble people, not simply technological um, reasons. And then we get to learn something about Chingachgook, who responds to him, "You have told the story, you have the story told by your fathers. What say your old men? Do they tell the young warriors that the pale faces met the red men, painted for war and armed with a stone hatchet or a wooden gun?" And Hawkeye replies, "I'm not a prejudiced man, nor one who vaunts himself on his natural privileges, though the worst enemy I have on earth, and he is an Iroquois, daren't deny that I am a genuine white. Um, and I'm willing to own that my people have many ways of which, as an honest man, I can't approve." So, in their discussions, we can see the defensiveness of one and the assertiveness of the other, right? And the setup of the European settler, this new American now, trying to account for um, the deaths of the Native Americans in the past, right? And the views of the European settlers and now Americans of the Native Americans as being savage and primitive, um, and in some ways subhuman. And then we see the wisdom near the bottom of that paragraph on 532, where Hawkeye says, "Every story has two sides, so I ask you, Chingachgook, what passed when our fathers first met?" And in that statement, we learn a lot about Hawkeye and his respect for the Native American and his willingness to confront problematic parts of his own culture and history. And that is something I think that, we can appreciate. So one of the things to think about, that's how the indirect or the implied characterization works, right? You read those words spoken by the character and you make judgments about their character based on what they've said. That's the implied characterization. I think, when you read a passage like this and you think about something like the last of the Mohicans falling out of favor, all of the reasons why people find a text like this to be troubling or problematic are completely valid. I think what you risk losing in not reading them is understanding that people were thinking about these things, right? It's not as though just recently people have begun to think about what was done to the Native Americans by settlers. They were thinking about it very early on, and it's not as though Fenimore Cooper was the first to do it. He articulates it in a very nice way. And so I think these are valuable texts to look at in those regards. But there's a lot going on in this short selection. I wanted to try and use it as an illustration for how we can look for certain things in the text. When we start looking at Hawthorne, you'll be familiar now with how the forest can work as a Gothic setting. Hawthorne is the absolute master of sound, so we'll look specifically at sound with Hawthorne. So hopefully this little discussion sets you up nicely for the upcoming readings as well.